Christian values were little known or followed. Religion was a pantheon of all kinds of gods and idols. Business practices were corrupt. Violence was routine. Promiscuity was a part of religious worship. Marital morality was minimal. Divorce, abandonment, they were a frequent part of the society and the culture. The cities, Roman cities, were dangerous and filthy places. Life expectancy in the Roman Empire was far less than half of what it is today in America. In the typical family, children died. Almost every family had children that died, and children that grew up to maturity normally lost at least one of their parents before they reached adulthood. Modern means of birth control were unknown, and so abortion was far more common in the Roman Empire than anything in America today. And because medical procedures were primitive, germ theory was unknown, antibiotics didn't exist, soap had not yet been invented, and so when abortions were performed, often the women either died or were left infertile. Infanticide, it was common. What they would do would take a newborn baby and take the child either down to the seashore or up into the hills or the mountains and just abandon the child and let the child die by exposure. Although infanticide was almost exclusively with female babies. So they would see at birth whether it was a male or a female. If it was a boy was valued, so a boy was kept. A female was not. And so a girl was abandoned to die. The long-term results of that were an enormous gender disproportion in the Roman Empire. There were far more men than there were women. And disease was rampant. It was epidemic after epidemic. Measles, smallpox, the bubonic plague. And as a result, sometimes half of the population of a city would die. And the Roman government would then repopulate the cities. What they would do would be to send their army out to some other part of the empire, and they would bring people by the tens of thousands to replace those who had died in the epidemics. It was chaotic because they brought in people who didn't know each other, people who spoke different languages, who had no place to live, who didn't have any trade, just in order to keep the population where they wanted it to be. Religiously, the Roman government did something that was really unusual for ancient empires, and that is that they were religiously tolerant. They didn't impose their religion upon those that they conquered. So a conquered people could keep their religion as long as they would pledge their allegiance and be faithful to the Roman emperor. But increasingly, the government turned against Christians. And the watershed date was on July 19th in AD 64. The city of Rome burned. It was a city largely of wooden tenements and narrow streets. And the flames just spread rapidly. For 3 days, much of Rome burned. And then finally, there were fire breaks and the fire began to subside. Except after that 72 hours and then the break, it started up again. And once again, the city was aflame as it had been before. Some of the most famous landmarks were forever lost, so that we don't know today exactly all of what was available or what it was like. And many people lost their lives, and tens of thousands in the city of Rome were then left homeless. And the people of Rome, yeah, they had a pretty good idea how this happened. They figured that it was their own emperor, Nero, who had ordered the fires, because he saw himself as a builder, and he wanted to design the city for himself. He wanted to build a new city that would last for millennia. And so the only way to do that was to destroy the city that was already there. In fact, The word was out in the street that when the fire would stop, that they would have soldiers that would reset it. And when firefighters would come in, the soldiers would actually stop them from putting out the flames. And so the resentment, the animosity toward Nero was rising rapidly. And he realized that he had a political crisis on his hand, so he needed to blame somebody else. And he chose to blame the Christians. Christians up until then had been seen as a subset of Judaism, like a Jewish denomination. And because they allowed the conquered peoples to keep their religion, Christianity got cover from the Jews. But Nero began to change that. And he sort of built off of what were common rumors, what today we would call conspiracy theories. It was said that Christians were cannibals, that it was well known that they would meet in secret, often at night, and they would eat the body and drink the blood of their leaders. That they were well known because Christians had sexual orgies. They all came together in wild sexual promiscuity. That's what a Christian was, because their leader taught them that they all were required to love one another. And that Christians were against family values. Everybody knew that Christians were against family values because the family was not the hierarchy. It was Jesus Christ, their leader, who had greater loyalty than parents or children or anybody else. And so Caesar, Nero, seized upon that. He seized upon the rumors that were out there, and he blamed the Christians, and he authorized widespread persecution of those who were followers of Jesus Christ. The Roman historian Tacitus tells us some of the things that Nero ordered, and they are not very easy to read. He had many Christians crucified, so much so that they said that some of the roads had so many crosses on them that when you looked down the road, you couldn't see the end of the line of Christians that were being crucified. That he would have Christians covered in fresh animal skins that were sewed on tight, and then throw them to wild dogs who would rip them apart. That he would take Christians and put them on hooks in the imperial gardens and cover them with pitch, and then light them on fire alive so that they could illumine the dinners that Nero would host. Tacitus said that the worst of criminals in Rome felt sympathy and compassion toward Christians because criminals suffered nothing close to the treatment that was theirs. It was in the midst of all of this that St. Peter wrote the words in 1 Peter 2, 9-12. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, Peter writes, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. They were violently mistreated. They were misunderstood. They were accused of things they didn't do. And how do you respond to that? Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God. That's us. That's us. Peter's not just talking to them in the first century. He's talking to us as followers of Jesus in the 21st century. He says, you're chosen. God chose you to be on his team. So I've never been much of a very good athlete. I did get a varsity letter in high school, but barely got a varsity letter in high school. And I certainly wasn't as good at sports as some of my friends when I was growing up. And perhaps like others, there are memories in grade school when two people would step up in the gym or out in the field, and out of the class they would pick who would be on which team. And if you're not picked early on, it is an excruciating experience. And you hope and you pray that you will not be last. And you watch the camaraderie that is being built up as these two teams develop, and you're still there and you're still not chosen. So yeah, I've stood there, but I want to tell you that there were some times when I was actually chosen first. And it was a great feeling. I wasn't chosen first because I was that good at sports. I was chosen first because a friend of mine was up there doing the choosing. And it was out of friendship. It was because my friend liked me, not because I would be very good at first base or playing basketball. But that's the way it is with God. Peter says, you are chosen. Honestly, it's not because you're good looking or good at sports or because you have a lot of money, or it's none of those things. It's because God likes you. It's because he wants you on his team. As a Christian, you are a chosen people. And he says a royal priesthood. You know, every now and then when you want to call somebody in a business, maybe somebody that you already know, but you don't know that person's actual private number or extension, you call into the switchboard and you get into a voicemail system that is just agonizing, especially when you're back to stage one after 2 or 3 different tries. And you've tried putting the numbers in, but it doesn't quite work, and then you have a computer that says just say the numbers, and they come up with completely different numbers. It's highly frustrating. How much better it is if you have the private number or the extension of the CEO of the company that you want to reach. You have the PIN number. That's what we are. We are a royal priesthood. We have God's direct line. We have the PIN number of God. We have direct access. We don't have to go through anybody else. We don't have to go through a switchboard. God gives us not only the access of being priests to God, but a royal priesthood, and royal priests are members of the royal family. So we are kind of like at the top of the list. So you're chosen, you're a royal priesthood, you're a holy nation. Holiness refers to being different, and Christians are. We're different. We're like God. We belong to a nation of God-like citizens. That means we don't look quite like, or sound quite like, or behave like everybody else. You're a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God. That's us. There's an enormous value to being someone who belongs to God. I don't know if you're up early enough this morning to watch the news, but one of the top news stories today is that Pope Francis had a new car given to him today, a Lamborghini. It's a really nice, really expensive sports car. It's kind of hard to imagine him driving around
hard to work a stick in a robe.
Beach in a Lamborghini, but so he's going to sell it, but he blessed it. So now it's a blessed Lamborghini that is going to actually go out to auction. And the money will be used to support churches that have been attacked under ISIS in the Middle East. But this isn't the first time this has happened. Pope Francis was also given a Harley Davidson. So if you have trouble imagining him driving a Lamborghini, imagine him with his papal hat on driving a Harley. And what's interesting is on February 20th of 2014, his Harley Davidson was sold at auction, you bikers, for $327,000. The Harley had been given to him. I'm not enough on motorcycles to know, but if you know, it was a 2013 custom Dyna Super Glide that was given to the Pope by Willie Davidson, the grandson of the founder of Harley Davidson. Okay, so get this. This is a used motorcycle. that sold for 24 times its manufacturer's suggested retail price of $13,589. It was used at over $300,000. How could it possibly be worth that much? Well, you know, it was worth that much because of who it belonged to. The value was in the name and the person of Pope Francis, not in Harley Davidson. And that's us. Our value isn't in the way we look or the jobs that we have or the address that is ours. It's not how much money we have in the bank or the degrees that we've earned from colleges and universities. It's that we belong to Jesus Christ. That makes us worth a whole lot more than $327,000. That makes us worth billions. We belong to God. We are a holy nation. That's who Christians are. But holiness is not just who we are, it's also what we do. We're different. We're different because of our relationship with God, and that makes our behavior different. If we are Christians, of course we behave in a different way. I mean, it simply wouldn't make sense to behave like an unbeliever. It wouldn't be good to behave as if we weren't on God's team, as if we weren't Christ's priests, as if we were citizens of some other nation or didn't belong to God. So, what we're supposed to do, Peter says, is live like Christians who glorify God. So I'll admit to you that for a long time I used that expression and I didn't really even know what it meant. And kind of wondering, one day I actually went and did some research. The word that we use for glorify comes from a Greek word. The Greek word is doxa. It's the word from which we get the name of the hymn, the doxology. And in its classical meaning, it had to do with a person's reputation. So one working definition of glorify God is to enhance God's reputation. It's to make God look good. So it's not that we improve on who God is in his essence or his attributes, but frankly, God's reputation is often terrible. And what we do as Christians is bring God's reputation into line with who God is and how God actually is. We align the reputation of God. We make God look good. That's what Christians do. And that's what the early Christians did in the first and the second and the third century. Husbands and wives were faithful to each other. Not all of them, but most of them. They avoided divorce. Women were treated with dignity and respect. They weren't in the empire, but they were in the church. Christians didn't have abortions. They kept and they loved their girl babies. The church would step out of wherever it would gather, and they would go, sometimes every night, out to the seashore, or up into the hills, or up into the mountains, and they would listen for the cry of an abandoned child. And they would find a newborn baby girl still alive, and they would snatch her up and they would bring her home, and they would love her, and they would raise her in their own home and their own family. Pagans in those days married really young. There were many girls who were never, ever allowed out of the house where they were born. Because there was such a shortage of women, they would be kidnapped. Many of them went from the parents' house into marriage at 11 or 12 years old. Christians, by contrast in the church, they insisted that their women not marry until they were 18 to 20 years old and that they be virgins. So what was happening in the overall country and culture is that the pagans increasingly had an enormous shortage of women. And the church had extras. There were plenty. And for those of you trained in economics, we would say that the church sort of cornered the female market in the Roman Empire. And as a result, a lot of pagan men started showing up at church. And they were looking for women. They were looking for wives. But the church insisted that marriages could only take place between believers. And it was required that any men who wanted to find wives in the church had to first become followers of Jesus Christ. And it was not always a simple or instant process. They had to be educated and trained. They had to be baptized. They had to prove themselves. And as a result, by the hundreds of thousands, men came to the churches and they became Christians and they married. They converted from paganism to Christianity. And then when the plagues would sweep the cities and the empire would bring in tens of thousands of new immigrants, the church was the place where they were always welcome. If they couldn't find a place to sleep, a place to go, if they couldn't find food or a job, if they couldn't find someone who would try to understand their language, if they were desperate in the new city that the emperor had forced them to go to, now they could find the church, and the church was always welcoming. The church was always inviting to those immigrants, and those immigrants got jobs and homes and became Christians. Became Christians by larger and larger numbers. And the long-term result of all of this was nothing short of astounding. So in my college education in history, I was told and taught that because of the Edict of Milan, the Roman Emperor Constantine declared that Christianity was the legal religion of the Roman Empire. As I was taught, it was because in a battle he wore an insignia that had the Greek letters Chi Rho, the first two letters in Greek of the word Christos, or the word Christ, and he won the battle. And so he decided that everybody should become a Christian. If you read Rodney Stark's book, The Rise of Christianity, he has a very different approach. That it wasn't about a battle, and it wasn't about an insignia. It was about a political necessity, because there were so many Christians by then in the Roman Empire that Constantine had hardly any other choice. So here are the estimated statistics. Rodney Stark gets a baseline. He says in AD 40, there were about 1,000 Christians in the empire. And you may want to pick at that and say, well, Pentecost was before that, and there were 3,000, but you've got to get a baseline for figuring out the stats. So let's accept what he said. In AD 40, 1,000 Christians in the Roman Empire. That constituted 17 1,000th of 1%. It is so statistically insignificant, it's virtually zero. But they glorified God, and they lived faithfully in some of the worst of circumstances. And the number of Christians began to multiply. You know, if you are fortunate enough in a time of low interest to be able to get a 7% return on your money, it'll double in 10 years. It's the law of compounding. If you're very fortunate and your money can get 10% interest, it'll double in 7 years. So jump from AD 40 to AD 200, and from 1,000 Christians in the empire to 218,000 Christians in the empire. But statistically, 218,000 Christians is 36 100ths of 1% of the population of the empire. But they glorified God. And even when the pagans persecuted them, they loved them and were faithful. And so the compounding continued until in AD 350, there were 33.9 million Christians in the Roman Empire, constituting over 56% of the population. There were more Christians than there were unbelievers, and the emperor had no choice but to declare that the Roman Empire is a Christian empire. How did they do this? How did they pull this off? They lived holy lives. As aliens and strangers in the world, they abstained from sinful desires and lived such good lives among the pagans that though they were accused of doing wrong, the pagans saw their good deeds and they glorified God. All right, what about now? What about modern pagans? What about how Christians live around the world, and specifically how we live out our faith in Jesus Christ here in America in this second decade of the 21st century. How are we doing? Well, Christians are at the forefront of stopping human trafficking around the world. An estimated 45 million are trafficked every year. And you'll find Christians in places near and far who are stepping up to stop this atrocity. You find that Christians are the ones who are espousing the authority and truthfulness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. You find that immigrants are bringing the gospel of Jesus Christ to America, many times from countries that are very Christian and where the fires of revival are burning in unprecedented numbers. So, if you start looking at what's happening, you begin to realize that some historians are saying that hundreds of years from now, people will look back and say that the beginning of the 21st century was one of the periods of one of the greatest spiritual awakenings in history. Because I believe that Christians are doing it again. Doing again now what was done there then in the Roman Empire. Living holy lives that enhance the reputation of God and impress pagans with the power and the salvation of Jesus Christ. But then I've had those who have said to me, and I've heard them say publicly, Christianity in America is 3,000 miles wide and 1 inch deep. And I just have to tell you, that is not my experience. As someone who travels this country a lot, I will tell you it is far from what I have seen and experienced. So, if you take that premise that Christianity in America is only 1 inch deep, how do you find out whether that's true or not? And the answer is that you take out a knife, a scalpel, and cut deeper than 1 inch and see what you find. So I can tell you that I was in Littleton, Colorado, the day of the shootings at Columbine School. That Charlene and I went over to the school, and the perimeter fence had thousands and thousands of notes that were written. We spent several hours just reading the notes, and they were quotes of Scripture. They were declarations of faith in Jesus Christ. They were communications of the gospel and the grace of God. I remember well the terrorist attack of September 11, 2001. It produced more testimonies of faith in Jesus Christ than anything that I can remember in recent history. The unspeakable shootings at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. And then that these godly, far deeper than 1 inch Christians who survived that, who had let someone kindly into their Bible study who killed their church members, and they called for forgiveness. That is a deep Christian faith, living it out. What happened when Ebola was sweeping across West Africa? Who were the doctors that stayed behind and risked their own lives in a disease that seemed to have no cure and no stopping? It was missionaries, it was Christians from America that did it. So the next time there is a hurricane or a tornado or an epidemic, just watch. Watch television and listen to the interviews and see and hear time after time declarations of faith in Jesus Christ. When a home has been lost, when a child has died. 2 weeks ago, the shooting in the church in Sutherland Springs, Texas, and the pastor who's lost his 14-year-old daughter teaches what the scriptures say when you're up against something you never could have imagined would happen to your own child. Yeah, watch it on TV, listen, talk to people, and you will witness the powerful testimonies of people with strong Christian faith. I'll tell you, I'm awed by the lives of Christians when they face unexpected tragedies, because they are, quoting Peter from AD 67, a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that we may declare the praises of him who called us out of darkness and into his wonderful light. May that be you. May you live such a holy life that you enhance the reputation of God. There was a brilliant young pianist in London. He hadn't done a public concert, but the word was already out in the arts community that he was exceptionally talented. And so when he did his inaugural concert in a recital hall in London with 1,000 seats, every seat was sold out and every seat was